Hello, lovely listeners. Today I have the great honour of chatting with Philip Webb. Philip Webb is the founder and MD of Investors in Community, which is a digital SaaS platform built on blockchain technology, which is obviously the buzzword of the moment. And it enables businesses and individuals to donate, volunteer and gift to charity and community initiatives that matter to them. I've already had the pleasure of speaking to Philip briefly, and I understand a little bit more about this, and it's an amazing, amazing platform. So if you get the opportunity to go and have a look at this, or if something that's interests you, then I definitely recommend it. Philip also built his first business, and I don't know what that business is, to 6.4 million in 4 years, and was mentored by one of business management's finest minds and creator of the SWOT analysis, Albert Humphrey. And I know that Philip and Albert became partners and friends over the years. It was quite an unusual friendship, I think. And in the end, when Albert passed away, he basically left all of his intellectual protocol, that's not the right word, property, sorry, to Philip. In terms of the work that he'd created over his lifetime, which I did hear some of that story on Bethan's podcast, which I loved. So I'm interested to hear a bit more about Albert. And so Philip is basically a serial entrepreneur, an amazing businessman, very heart-centered person, and an all-round nice guy. And I'm really looking forward to this chat. So thank you so much for being here today, Philip.
Well, I'm blushing at the introduction, Mel. Thank you very much for having me.
Right. Well, I love to know more about my guests. I'm always intrigued as to what made the successful person that, or what pivoted in your life, because some of my guests have, a bit like me, get into the corporate rat race and all the rest of it, and then decide that just doesn't cut the mustard and they want something with more purpose. So yeah, I'd love to know a little bit more about your backstory, Philip.
Well, how far back do you want to go, Mel?
I don't mind. I love to know, what was it you wanted to be as a kid? And does that even marry up anywhere close to what you've done in your life? And, education and all of that, how did it all sort of drive through?
Yeah, okay. Well, it sort of does match in a way. As a kid, I'll go back to sort of the 8, 9, 10-year-old kid. Painfully shy, by the way.
Yeah, me too.
Really shy. I wouldn't have said boo to a goose. Didn't speak to a girl till I was 18. It's one of those really shy people. And I was always into books. I read prolifically as a child. We were allowed 3 library books a week from the local library, and I always got 3. And I finished them by Wednesday. And it was I just prolifically read. I thoroughly enjoyed books. So a lot of my childhood was based on that. I was a chess player. My dad taught me chess when I was about 7, and we had this little thing in our family, actually, and I guess this is the spark of the entrepreneur competitiveness coming out now. We had this little thing in our family. My grandfather had a chess set. It was only a little ordinary little wooden one, very plain, but it was my grandfather's. And when the rule says when the person in the family beats the person that owns the chess set, it passes to them. So it had naturally passed to my dad. And I tried like anything to beat my dad over several years, actually, of getting better and better. I joined the chess club at school. I became the chess champion at the junior school, and I still couldn't beat him. And I'll never forget the fateful day when it was actually the Cambridge and Oxford rowing race, and I was a bit distracted looking at that at the same time as trying to beat my dad. And finally, I realised I had him, and that was it. It was the most euphoric moment as the chess set passed to me. And
how old were you? Can you remember?
I was, I think I was 12. I think.
Oh, brilliant!
11 or 12. I was a young kid, but it was an amazing moment which stuck in my mind through all my life, really. But I guess that brings us back to my influences, and my dad clearly is one of the biggest influences in my life. He's a great guy. He took himself with no qualifications from a door-to-door salesman back in the 60s to become an international director of Maytag Corporation, which owns Hoover UK, etc., etc. So he went to the top with nothing behind him apart from his own guile and tenacity and innovation. He's a fantastic marketeer. I don't know if you remember the Hoover vacuum cleaners and the "it beats as it sweeps as it cleans." There's a little jingle that went to it. Yeah. That's my dad. The little air freshener nozzle that you turned up for air freshener, that was his invention, and things like this. He was always doing something. He renovated houses. He got his hands dirty. He was a tradesman by background, and he taught me the tools of the day, carpentry. But I was also into electronics, and I love the idea of electronics and computers, so much so that when I was at school writing an essay on silicon chips, that's right, and the teacher clearly didn't know the difference between a silicon chip and a microprocessor, so I educated him. That was the wrong one. So, and he said, I want 2.5 sides. Well, I wrote about 20. I was hypothesizing about the future of technology and what it's going to do for us, and he gave me a fail. And he said, I asked for 2.5 sides. He clearly had this thing with me, and I didn't like him very much. So I had to condense my whole essay into 2.5 sides, which I thought was awful.
Yeah.
But I was always into technology. I went through school wanting to be something in technology, electronics, computers, or the idea of computers in those days fascinated me. And I was always into technology. I love reading The Tomorrow People. If any of your listeners remember The Tomorrow People.
I never read it myself, but I do remember it, yeah.
Early 70s TV show, the fantastic idea that telekinesis could actually happen. And I was firmly convinced I could make stuff move with my mind if I concentrated enough.
I still think that now, Philip. I'm trying all the time.
So I'll tell you a funny story, actually. When I was about 10, actually, because I was firmly convinced I was watching The Tomorrow People and everything else. And there was this thing on the radio. Radio 1 said, we're waiting for our first ever colour broadcast on the radio. And I'm thinking, wow, that's amazing. And so they said, close the curtains. So I closed the curtains and I sat on the floor with the radio in front of me. And it said, right, now just watch carefully. You'll be able to see colours around the radio. I said, I can see them. Well, my parents were laughing their head off. It was the 1st of April, wasn't it? And I felt hook, line and sinker. But technology and the application of it was just a fascinating concept. So I was always in my life, technology, bit of an entrepreneurial spark from my dad, practical with tools, built go-karts for myself, built dens in the fields and hammer and nails and saws and all sorts of things. So very sort of practical, very happy childhood, really. My dad was the leading figure in my life, and it was fantastic. So got to the age of 16, had a clutch of A-levels, about 9 of them, sorry, O-levels, about 9 O-levels. So I thought, right, apply to a college. I didn't want to do A-levels. So I went to the Kitson College of Technology in Leeds, where it's a fantastic course, taught me everything from welding to electronics and everything in between. So it was an electromechanical engineering course at diploma level, which is the same as A-levels. So I sort of scraped through that because I sort of lost interest halfway through in the academia side of it. And eventually got my diploma. Then I thought, right, I'll go and be a software programmer in the days when software was a dark art and nobody knew anything about it. So I thought I'll apply for interviews. I got some interviews that wanted Fortran programmers. And I thought, well, I have no idea what Fortran is. So I looked it up in a book, picked up a few buzzwords, went for the interview as a sort of 18-year-old kid and didn't get the jobs. 52 jobs later, I thought, my uncle then turned around and said, well, have you thought about engineering? He said, from a computer sense, he said, because he was a computer engineer. So he sort of gave me a few ideas. So I applied for a few jobs. And fortunately, I got a job after a whole 2 days of interviews and practical tests with IBM. Oh, yeah. I was pretty much over the moon out, actually.
Yes.
And we were living in Chalfont St Peter in Buckinghamshire. And this offer letter came through. And it was £7,000 a year, which is a great salary in those days, in the early 80s. Company car, company Cavalier. I thought, brilliant. And it's in Brentford. And I thought, it's just up the road. This is amazing. Thank you very much. I wrote back to them, thank you, I'm accepting. And I showed a few people on my offer letter. I was proud as punch for this. And one of my friends turned around and said, Phil, it doesn't say Brentford, it says Brentwood. I thought, well, where the hell's Brentwood? You know, it's in Essex, isn't it? So that's how I accidentally left home at 19 and rented myself a flat, and then bought my first flat at 19 and settled into a wonderful career with IBM as an electrical mechanical engineer, looking after the golf ball typewriters. And people are either nice to me and say, I remember those, or the nasties. I don't remember those, Phil. They were early 80s. You go.
I ain't got a clue what that is.
Yeah,
before you carry on, though, how did you just skipped over, I bought my own flat at 19? How? How?
In those days, 95% mortgage. I'd saved a little bit of money, not a lot, a couple of grand. It wasn't an expensive flat. It was £19,000. So, not 5% of that wasn't a huge amount of money. So I managed to get the mortgage. I had my IBM salary to back me up at that point. So it was a relatively easy concept. And mortgages were very strict in those days. It was 2.5 or up to 3 times your salary. And that was it. Yeah. So I just scraped in under that for £19,500 for my flat. And I bought it. Interesting enough, people say, well, did your dad help you at this point? No, not really, no. My dad helped me in many, many, many ways. He also helped me to understand the theory of halves. So he would actually say, well, okay, you want a motorbike? Yeah, I want a motorbike. Well, you buy the motorbike, I'll buy you your jacket and your helmet. So I had to do that bit of it first before he would chip in with the rest of it. And he always taught me that valuable lesson. You've got to do it for yourself if you want any help from anybody else. Don't expect it on a plate because you ain't going to get it. And my dad could afford to do it, but he chose to do this with me, which is something I've carried throughout my life. So
nice.
there I was.
So golf ball typewriters?
Golf ball typewriters, yeah. Just 500 adjustments in this golf ball typewriter. Some of your more mature users like me would recommend them and say they were fantastic machines. They were worth £450 in the early 80s. That's a huge amount of money. And everybody had one. If you had an IBM golf ball typewriter, that was the business. That was the place to be. And of course, in those days, as an engineer, I was going out visiting lots and lots of people every day, doing service calls on these things. And I got a bit of the gift of the gab at that point, and I started selling service contracts to customers. And the IBM was fairly arrogant in those days. They were the market leaders in many scenarios of computers and hardware and software. And there's a famous saying, you never get fired for buying IBM. And they perpetuated this rather arrogant slogan throughout most of the 80s. And it was true, because if you went with IBM and it fell over, well, you've been to the best, therefore it wasn't your fault. And this whole mantra and this arrogance was sort of bred into you as an engineer, as an IBMer, really. So I became, quite chipper about life. I was selling service contracts, fixing machines, doing quite well. I was the youngest engineer ever in the UK, which is interesting. That was an experiment, which worked well for me, and it worked well for them as well. Hit a bit of a hiccup in 1985, being chased by 3 police cars trying to arrest me for drinking and driving, which they successfully did. So at the age of 21, I had lost my license, quite rightly.
Oh, wow.
too. And I was.
So you were drinking and driving. It wasn't mistaken.
I really was, yeah.
Right,
okay. I did it once in my life, and that was that. And I've never done it since, obviously. But that was my mistake. So that set me back a bit. So true to form, pick up the phone to my dad. Got a bit of problem here. He says, we'll meet. He said, so we met up, and he said, right, so you've got 3 options. You can either carry on as though nothing's happened and take a copy of your license. You can either there's a couple of options.
I like your dad.
Oh yeah. Or you can. By the way, my dad, when he came out of the army, drove for 2 years on a tank license. All right, he didn't have a driving license at all, so he was.
Can I just top that one? I lost my dad in 2006. He never had a license ever, and he died he died at 66. I don't know how the hell he used to get away with it every year, but he did.
Anyway, I did the right thing and confessed to my management at IBM, and got the old eye rolls and thought, goodness me, and I thought, I've lost my job, I'll lose my flat, I've lost everything. It was a really hard moment in time. And I talked to my managers, and they basically said, look, go to court, find out what's going to happen, and then we'll talk. So I thought, okay. So I went to court, I got a 12-month ban. So I went to talk to my managers. They said, right, we've created for you the worst patch in England.
Oh, nice.
I said, okay, where's that? They said, it's northwest London, Marylebone, Euston, King's Cross, Camden Town. And I said, okay. They said, here's a free bus pass for a year. Here's a free train pass for a year. Here's a free train, that tube and rail and bus pass for London. You're going to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning. You'll be down there for 8 o'clock. You'll be working, and this is your penance, if you like, but it's also your opportunity.
Right.
It's the worst patch in England. There's about 22 service calls. An engineer can handle about 14, usually maximum. And of course, with it being in London, engineers driving to London, they sort of went in for a quick fix most of the time. So I realized that there was probably lack of attention to fixing it permanently, fixing the problem, not servicing it correctly. So I worked my socks off. I was down there at sort of 7 o'clock in the morning, and I came back at 9 o'clock at night. And for about 6 months, I worked my tail off in this patch, in probably the worst conditions, walking up and down the Marylebone Road, wore a pair of shoes out every 3 months. That's what I did. Service calls came down from 21 to about 3.
Wow.
So I cracked it. And of course, then I got my license back and a car. And then I moved from Essex over to Luton. And everybody said, how did you manage all that? This is not quite right,
Yeah.
But I was working for it. Then I got a service award for all that work and sent to Venice for 4 days with the convention. So everybody sort of said, there's nothing, not quite right this. But it was through sheer hard work. And then I basically built my career around fixing computer equipment. Then I graduated from golf ball typewriters into computers. Ended up on the mainframes, the big ones, the huge mainframe farms under the ground in Warwick. Where if you go into the basement, you'll find all these computer farms where the lights turn on in front of you and turn off behind you, where you fix things at 3 a.m. because that's convenient for the customer. So I got into that, and I got a bit bored and wanted to get into sales. And they said, well, it's 1989, can't do it, headcount freeze. So I said, well, I'll leave. And they said, well, don't want you to do that, but if you do, there's still nothing we can do about it. But come back in 6 months and we'll guarantee you a job in sales. I said, that's ridiculous. So anyway, I left and thought, right, I'll do some of this myself. And I set up my first company in a bedroom, and I had a tin desk, a fax machine, and about 4 old disk drives that somebody had given me. It's worth about £800. That's all I had. And so I set myself up as a broker, reseller, wheeler dealer in computer parts, peripherals, and systems. One thing I had to my advantage is my reputation in IBM was fantastic, and I was one of the top engineers looking after Europe and Middle East by the time I left. So my reputation of making computers talk to each other, which sounds bizarre now because the internet wasn't around, and getting one system to talk to another was actually incredibly difficult and very technical. And we had all sorts of wires and monitors on lines and all sorts of things going on, and I was very good at that. So my reputation was good as I came out of IBM, and that sort of gave me the push into the market. They said, oh, wow, it's Phil Webb, and so I was riding high for 6 months to a year before the effect wore off. So I managed to basically cobble together some sales, service the customer. I knew nothing about business. Did about $250,000 year one, which I was very pleased about.
Wow.
But it's just buying and selling and margins on equipment, which I understood. And then, of course, I met, as you talked about, Albert Humphrey, Humph to his mates. And I got a phone call because one of my engineers said, "I've got this guy needs to speak to you, Phil." I said, "Who is he?" He said, "Albert Humphrey." I said, "Never heard of him." So he said, he phoned me up, and he's American by birth. So he said, "Young man," he says, "I can make you rich." And I said, "Well, nah, you're all right, thanks, Humph."
Yeah, whatever.
And so I didn't swear. And he kept phoning me. He kept saying, "I can help your business. I can do this. I can do that." I suppose I better meet him. Thank goodness I got over myself, because that was the start of a fantastic friendship and an incredible learning experience for me from one of the most prolific management scientists in the world, frankly. He developed in 1966, as you said, the SWOT analysis, originally called SOFT, by the way. It stood for Satisfactory, Opportunities, Faults, and Threats. And that was a small piece in the jigsaw puzzle that he created a whole change management program called Team Action Management. And so that was how I started in business change in my own business, which allowed it to grow to £6.7 million, 52 staff members making some substantial profits. And I sold that in 96. That was my first exit.
So was that business the one you started buying and selling computer parts?
Yeah.
Right, okay.
Yeah, so year one was $250,000, year two was about 1.2, year three was about 3.4, year four, 6.7. And then we improved the margins for a couple of years and then sold out partially successfully. So because it was an earn-out contract, they never work. I wouldn't recommend one to anybody. So
yeah, I know a couple of people that have done them, but I don't know the ins and outs. So
no. So I guess my key drivers were all about innovation, all about the art of the possible. And I was fascinated with what could be done with technology. And then in business, I started to learn about how a business works, and that quite understood it. It was perfectly logical. It was like the schematic diagram of any computer. So it was dead easy for me to understand how it worked, how things fitted together, how finance worked. I learned that very quickly. And that launched my career into business. So I guess my background drivers are really my dad, Albert Humphrey in business, and a desire to succeed at least as well as my father. And that was obviously the key thing, and always has been, if I'm honest. Make your dad proud. I'm one of those.
Yeah, definitely. So you met Humph while you still had your first big business, that business that went to 6.7. And then obviously that continued, that friendship and partnership. So what happened when you earned out, sold out? What happened next?
97 that would have been. So didn't do a lot. I started looking at virtual reality in business, because in 1995 I became a pest to my own business, to be honest. I had a management team, and they did all the work of buying and selling. We had big corporates like NatWest, Ministry of Defence, and people that we supplied. We also had an international side that brokered all over the world. And we had a little gem in the middle of Nijmegen in Holland, which I managed to crack. and it was the returns warehouse for Digital Equipment Corporation, which is the second largest computer company in the world. And their returns warehouse, those people that had wrongly ordered it, it had arrived, they didn't want it anymore, it was surplus stock, ended up in this warehouse, and I managed to get access to this warehouse with their blessing. And I walked around it once a quarter like a kid in a sweet shop, because there were systems there that were retailing at sort of 60, 70,000 pounds. You can have it for 8. Really? Okay. So I used to buy this on the basis you don't sell it in Europe. That was the key. Somebody sold it to the States, and the States were scratching their heads saying, it's normally us selling to you, we're cheaper than you, and you've got this incredible deal. And I shipped all this stuff off to America, and we turned about £3 million with America on that basis. So that was basically the gems of the business were around that. Sorry, what was your question? I've lost track of my thought.
Yeah. So basically what I was interested in is when you sold that business, what happened next? Because I knew you already were with Humph at that point. So
yeah. So obviously Humph and I stayed in touch, didn't do a lot in 97. I was renovating a farmhouse at the time. Then I set up a joint venture with BDO in Manchester. And we started looking at putting a management consultancy stroke IT consultancy company together, and growing that on the back of Manchester, almost like a parasitic marketing technique. We'll talk to all the clients of BDO. We'll flush this service throughout them and add some value to the clients. That was all good in theory, but I'm not an accountant, and I wasn't qualified. Although I do teach finance today, strategic finance, not bookkeeping. The accountants sort of put their glasses on halfway down the nose and said, you're not qualified, young man, you're not one of us. Therefore, we won't allow you to have access to our client base. So it ended up all the clients of this BDO joint venture company was actually off client base. So we started advising the government on small business service as it got set up. And we were doing work outside of the firm, a couple of clients in the firm, but it wasn't the sort of the panacea of opening the doors and suddenly all these clients would be available to us to talk to. Didn't happen. So again, I had to almost start all over again, really. So it wasn't quite what we envisaged. But nevertheless,
was that you and Humph, or was that you and someone else?
No, that's just me on my own, with a small team that I hired as well. Humph and I were in daily, weekly contact anyway. He'd become one of my family members by this point. I went to his 8-year-old daughter's school plays and all sorts with him when I was in London. So we were very sort of close as a family. He'd obviously got his much younger wife and a young daughter. So even in his older years, he still had all those school plays and school reviews to go to. So I used to turn out with Humph and Miriam used to go as the parents of Stefania. And I used to tag along because they asked me to. So the teachers were really confused because they had mum and dad, and then it was me. Who's he sat there smiling at me and saying, oh, she's doing very well. So it's quite bizarre, but no, we're very, very close. We met as often as possible. And basically Humph described me, because he's American, obviously, as his English son almost. So his American children were in playwright, dentistry, doctors and whatever. And so they had no interest in Humph's work whatsoever. So when he passed, sadly, in 2005, which was a shock, even though he's 79, it was still a huge shock to me. And then suddenly he said he'd left all of his research to me in about 40 boxes, which he carefully filed and catalogued over his years.
How did his, I know I heard this before, that the kids had no interest in that sort of thing, but how did they feel about that?
I don't think they had any knowledge of it before, since, or after. They just, there's very little contact. Humph, in his own way, was not close to his American children. They had all sorts of family politicking stuff going on, so he was never very close to them. Stefania was into medical stuff as she grew older, and she's an accomplished medic in California right now. So again, no real interest. So there was me, and there was 1 or 2 others which he could have included, but he chose to leave everything to me. And I made him a promise that I would be the custodian of his life's work. So in 2014, frustrated a little bit because of the recession that followed 2007, about not getting it out there as much, this program called Team Action Management. So I wrote the book. So Managing Constant Change, Leading Constant Change is actually the title of the book. Buy it on Amazon today if you want. And it is the accumulation, the whole summary of Humphrey's life's work, everything he ever taught and knew. It was with his blessing before he passed, because I'd written his whole manual for him. And he just chuckled. He said, this is my life's work. I said, yes, it is. He said, this is amazing. He said, so this is more than just the Team Action Management product. This is actually all the background. I said, yes, it's all the whole lot. So he thought it was wonderful. And I got it all bound up and gave him a copy, and his big beaming smile on his face. And so I converted that into a book, published that. That's my third book I published. So,
are you able to give a very high line of what that is?
Team action management. Well, it's basically all about solving the problem of how do chief execs and directors plan. So if you go back in time to the 50s, you had corporate planners that basically were internal consultants. They borrowed your watch to tell you the time. So they present this wonderful glossy plan to the chief exec and the board, but actually the sales director and the finance director sat there thinking, that's my numbers. You're presenting you asked me. And so the corporate planner fell out of favor, and eventually they fell away as a function. But then who plans? And that was a question asked in 1964 when this think tank that Humphrey's part of came together. And so the methodology for corporate planning was the whole essence of team action management. It was originally called participative planning, but nobody could say participative planning very easily. No. So it became team action management in 1971. But it's all about involving everybody. Now, SWOT is mistaught on most occasions. You end up with the 4 boxes on a screen with the SWOT in it, and you think you sit there with whoever you're talking to, and you write, or you do it on your own, and you write down all the things you can think of. But there's the rub. There's only one brain in there. So I can write what I think. And if I ask you, I also get the benefit of your ideas and input, which might be different to mine. And you might have different knowledge. You might have more knowledge in this area, and I might have different knowledge over here. So it's all about bringing brains together. Imagine the whole workforce being able to input to that particular analysis. And team action management is a methodology for doing just that. In 1962, I think it was, the psychologists at Stanford Research Institute in America gave these industrialists a big, thick tome of information. And they said, psychologically speaking, this is how teams work. This is why people think the way they do. This is what they do and how they react. This is the Bible of team management. And they took that and they turned a few pages, thought, we haven't a clue what this means. There's too many long words in it. Yeah. So they translated that into the team action management program. So when you run the program, which is rules-based, step by step by step, like I could teach you, I could teach anybody how to run it. And that book actually will teach you how it works as well. Then you're actually enacting the psychology of team psychology. So essentially, that's what team action management is. It brings together all the workers, providing anonymous feedback against a statement of intent for change or development or growth. Everybody can comment positively, negatively, questioningly. I've had pictures come back. It's all anonymous, single form per submission. You get hundreds of them. And then the team action management program is basically a way of filtering, sorting, disseminating information, creating sub-projects. And all those sub-projects point back to that statement of intent that we started with. Everything is beautifully aligned. Now, in business, about 17% of companies have actually got their vision, mission statements up here aligned with the internal operations, because normally it's set up by a board or a few people. It's a lovely document. They all think, oh, this is fantastic. This is our statement of strategy, intention, and vision. It sits on that bookcase behind you. It comes out maybe in the boardroom, it maybe does, but then translating that into specific tactics and actions in the operations of the business is done by, on average, 17% of businesses. So what about the other 83? Well, they get busy. The directors end up working in the business. They don't work on the business. And so this disconnect is something which concerned Hump's team way back then. Still a concern today. Directors spend little time on the business and too much time in the business. And if you get proper governance in place, you can solve it. Okay, so just for my simple brain, because I heard your podcast before, and you talked about this box, and people can anonymously put their stuff in, and then, you know, so they feel secure that, you know, people are not looking at it and all of that. So in simple terms, I'm a member of a team. I write down what I think. I put it in this box, as does 100 other people or whatever. Yeah. You take that information away to analyze it and do something with it. Is that right? Rather than the people above you. So the people who are in the management teams of the company you work for will be trained on how to run this program. We facilitate. Okay, got you. So they will all read, probably for the first time, about lots and lots of things they never knew happened. And I've seen management teams before, they said, well, why is that happening? That shouldn't be happening, but it is. And because as you go down filtered layers of management, as a worker on the ground floor, so to speak, if I report to my supervisor or my manager that there's a problem, I'm exposing myself individually to being a troublemaker, wrong. Somebody has a different opinion. My co-workers think I'm a snitch for saying something's wrong because they've enjoyed the perk of it being wrong for so long. All these different factors come into play. And so my ability to give an anonymous feedback, my have your say bit, if you like, anonymously to those very people who are senior enough and are operating the business to actually make something happen is a very powerful thing. You're skipping over all the layers of management. Temporarily, you have a completely flat structure in the company. And this is the concept of what we call fairness, because fairness is the second most powerful driver for human emotive response. So if you install a fair program, then people will respond. And so that's the idea behind that particular mechanism. And then the program picks up and it has certain things you must do, and filtering and subcategorizing, and then innovating the projects, which will then cumulatively make up the statement of work, which is then pushed back down into the business for the doing. So you might put a form in that says, I think this, I think that. Your co-worker might say the opposite. So we don't solve the forms in that planning session. We account for them, we listen for them, we take an understanding of it with a view to actually making something happen within a project. And those projects really are the drivers for the business. I was lucky enough to work with John Parnaby, who was Dr. John Parnaby, who was part of Lucas Aerospace, and he wrote a book called Managing by Projects. And it's quite probably more relevant today than it ever has been, because there is nothing in this world that's not changing right now. It's changing by the day, by the week, and managing by projects as opposed to this is what we're going to do for the next 12 months, because you won't. Something's going to happen. It's going to knock you off course. So having sub-projects which feather your business growth is a far more effective way of driving a business. We're in what they call the 1,000-year decade. And that's the hypothesis that says between 2020 and 2030, we're going to make as much change and progress as humankind as we have done in the previous 1,000 years. Think about that. That means every 4 days is equivalent to 1 year on average from the last 1,000. The pace of change is blisteringly fast right now. Technology, biomedical, people's working pattern. I looked at that in 2019 and I thought, I'm not sure that can happen, because people don't change that quickly. We are wedded to the norms. We're wedded to what worked before. We don't like change. It exposes us personally. We're fearful of change, generally speaking. There's a word for it, actually, and it's a lovely word. Your viewers can remember it, maybe. It's called metathesiophobia. Metathesiophobia. It's the unwarranted fear of change.
Right.
And we've all got it. And it can perpetuate and grow in certain situations, but this fear of change will hold us back. So I thought 10 years to do 1,000 years, no, I don't believe it really. And then COVID happened. And suddenly everybody changed because we had to. If I told you 2 years ago, you'll be doing podcasts on Zooms and everything, no, we do that in studios. Or you're going to have all your meetings, you can be sat at home with your slippers on. And sat in a business suit for the top half and your beach shorts in the bottom half. No, I'm not going to stand up. But people wouldn't believe that. And you've got the right to work from. That's ridiculous. Why would you do that? So all the norms have been shaken. And for that, I do believe this 1,000-year decade is happening.
Yeah.
So pace of change is massive. Team action management is a way of initiating, controlling, and delivering change quickly, efficiently, to the benefit of the business and all its workers.
So could you go into a massive organization, say like 40,000 people, but just deal with obviously one part of that? Or would you want to go in and deal with the whole 40,000? How would it work?
A bit like eating an elephant, really, isn't it? It's one bite at a time. So 40,000 is too big. You'd have 70 or 80,000 feedback forms. It would take you a week to read them all. No, we go in there and look at specific situations. I'll give you an example. We went to talk to Edinburgh Council and they had a particular issue with the estates department that they wanted to try and settle down. So we were brought in and we just looked at just the property and estates department of Edinburgh Borough Council and successfully got a change program running, which they then took over and very successfully delivered. So we look at sub-departments or indeed locations. If you're multi-located, then we'll take one location The usual rule is up to 1,000 staff at a time.
Yeah.
That gives you a bite-sized chunk out of the elephant, if you wish.
Okay, got you. Okay, cool. Well, I mean, it sounds amazing. Especially, I'm just thinking about my partner's company and the stuff that goes on there. I mean, it is massive, but yeah, something like that would be so useful. So useful,
You normally find the answers lie in the workforce anyway. Yeah. They all know the answers. It's just management perhaps haven't cottoned on or haven't got the resources or the communication connectivity to make sure they understand it. And the layers of authority often swerve us away from the true goal. I won't call it empire building or ivory towers, but it happens, and that circumvents all of this internal political rubbish.
Yeah.
And gets to the truth of the matter in a fair way, which motivates everybody towards a common goal. So that's what we did. And that appealed to me. And I guess this whole fairness thing has gone throughout my life. It's a theme that I understood before I met Humph, and he's built his program on fairness. And in 1987, when all the trees came down with Michael Fish's famous storm, I was working for IBM in North London, and me and two of my colleagues drove down from Luton, where we lived, into our North London territories, where the tubes weren't working, and there was all sorts who couldn't get in. There were priority 1 calls being logged all over London, and nobody to do them. So myself and my two colleagues said, right, forget the patch, forget the P2, P3 calls, P1 calls only today. And we shot all over London, fixing the priority urgent calls and sorting it. And our management team phoned us up about 3 or 4 days later. They said, just want to really thank you for what you did. I said, it's our job. And they said, well, we'd like to offer you a celebratory lunch and a gift voucher each. And all. I said, I'm going to refuse. Oh. Because that wasn't fair, because my colleagues who couldn't get into work because the tubes weren't working, they had no way of getting to work, wasn't their fault necessarily, was it? I was doing my job. And yeah, okay, in their eyes, I went above and beyond, but that's actually just me anyway. And that was my colleagues as well. So the fairness bit, I think, is always sort of woven in. The social justice bit, if you like, has always been there, woven into how I work. And I guess goes back to my dad, I suppose.